What's going on, guys? It's your boy beatsbyash, back at it again with another banger of a video. And today I've got someone very special today, my boy David. And what did you just get done doing with this past weekend, my guy?
What's up, Ashby? What's up, YouTube? So my name's David, and this past weekend we just made top 34. No, top 64. Got ahead of myself. I was top 34 at one point, then it dropped, but we made 52 out of 1,024 people running RP Law for EVO6 at Arlington.
Let's go, baby. Hashtag City Boys, we up. And this was your first regional that you have played all the way through. Is that just in this card game, or is it any card game in general?
Yeah, so I've had a couple experiences in other card games over the years. Probably 15 years ago, I was playing a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh! Then I played some other card games like Hearthstone, Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links, and for those that remember Duel Masters back in the day, that was one of my favorite games. So I've played through regionals in mainly Yu-Gi-Oh! But for One Piece, yeah, this is the first one I played all the way through. I played in Fort Worth back in November last year, and after one round, I kind of just dropped. Didn't really feel like playing then. I was just kind of there for my buddies. But this one, I made a commitment to myself that I'm just going to play through and see what happens. So here we are.
Awesome. And David and I have been working quite a bit together for some time since him joining the game. I just want to point out that he finished with a record of 8-2. And to my understanding, you really haven't had an opportunity to play in any locals at all. And this being the first event that you played all the way through, I think that is just an extremely major accomplishment. Not everyone can say that they're going to go 8-2, even when they've played in, several tournaments in the past.
Yeah, thanks, man. Yeah, just been really busy with work and schedule and stuff. So I really can't make it to any locals at all. So my only experience with playing in person for this game, really, besides the experience from other card games I've had, but this game's really just been mainly playing with you on Sim, messing around with different decks, seeing what works, and then just play testing with my buddies in the local scene, those that live close to me, and then I have some friends from other cities that I go to and visit, and then we just kind of play around then too. But yeah, nothing really competitive with this game until now, at least.
Hell yeah. Well, that's really awesome to hear. I bet for a lot of people who are watching this video that also may not have the opportunity just because of time constraints to go to locals, or maybe there's just not a store that is reasonably close to you, that there are still hopes for you to, perform at your best and, achieve a pretty high feat in one of these tournaments without being able to get a lot of in-person practice in. And I will say that I think that goal is more attainable and more reachable in this game over other games like Yu-Gi-Oh! And Magic, maybe Pokemon as well. I don't know if you would agree with that, but just me and my experience, I feel like Yu-Gi-Oh! Is just such a complicated game that, at least for me, if I'm preparing for an event in that game or in Magic, I have to play in person at events in order to really get those muscle memory skills in there, mainly because of ruling disputes. There are a lot of things that I feel like more so in those games than this game that you really have to find out for yourself how those go down, and you can't really replicate that to the same extent online. But in this game, for the most part, it's like, my card says I destroy your card. There are no disputes. I have 2/10 cost Big Mom. I say, haha, I win, you lose. There's no disputes. You just can't win. Yu-Gi-Oh! It's like, I'm doing this, that. I'm like, oh shit, well, I've never seen that before.
Right, exactly. In this game, most of the time, you're not really asking your opponent what their card does. There's two lines, two sentences. It's pretty easy. And then when you're going for lethal, they have the counter, they have the counter. If they don't have the counter, they don't have the counter, right? There's nothing too complex about that. What I will say about this game that I really enjoy though is the small little, I guess, micro decisions that happen. Like in Yu-Gi-Oh, right? There's no counters, nothing like that. So here it's just deciding what card to pitch for counter, deciding how many Dawn to put up. It's like a different form of resource management. So it's, to me, it's like comparing apples to oranges, but overall for sure this game's a lot easier to get into, and in my opinion, a lot easier to top with as well.
I agree. And that can be for several factors, being that there is a little bit higher variance, whether you like that or not, that is in the game. And as well, I just think this game, we can both agree, is more new player friendly. This has been a game that one of the biggest, pros for it for me has been that there's a lot of people in my friend group that I was already friends with, and I was never able to get them into one of the other card games that we have noted because of how complex it is and how much time it takes to actually just get a decent grasp of the game. With this game, it more so feels like anybody can jump in, and with a minimal amount of time spent, if you're working with people that do know a lot, you can definitely gain a lot of information in a short amount of time, and as well, like, start getting wins under your belt, like, almost immediately if you're doing the right things, right?
Yeah, 100%. I agree. Like most of my friends in my playtest group, it's like their first card game ever, and they're doing really well. They're some of the strongest players I know now, just because they put the time into it. And like you said, right, there's just not a lot of complexity into the game yet, and they're not trying to memorize 35,000 cards, 40,000 cards that exist. There's just a couple sets. Here's a couple cards that you put in your deck, and learn what you need to do. Learn when the right time to counter is, when you want to take life, when to turn your card sideways. And for the most part, you've mastered like 80, 90% of the game.
100%. Without going into like the math of the game, you have a good understanding of it. And while we're on this topic, I think it definitely helps that the game doesn't have that many sets yet. But I do want to know, before we get into this, when exactly did you start playing the game, and like what deck did you start out with?
Right. So I started playing the One Piece TCG. Let's see, it's around OPO2. So that was when like Whitebeard and stuff was really big. I kind of dabbled around with the game a little bit before then, but I really dug in OPO2, even though I was playing Blurple Croc. So it wasn't as strong as it is in OPO1, but Crocodile is my favorite character in One Piece, mainly because I only watched through the Alabasta arc. So he's really the only character I know. But I really enjoyed the playstyle of the deck. I love control decks and other card games I played. So just the fact that you can have a big hand, you're always drawing card, the value of a +1 draw, and then being able to like counter out of everything, like that felt really nice. And then I realized that that deck wasn't that competitive, so I switched over to black. So played a lot of Smoker. Smoker was, to this day, probably one of the most fun decks I've ever had. Going into OPO3, we stuck with the Black Rob Lucci for a little bit with the air door mechanic, and that's probably my favorite deck at this point. It's still OPO3 Rob Lucci.
Okay, hell yeah. It's kind of funny to think about the fact that we both joined the game with Blue Purple Croc, and we both switched off of it after realizing it wasn't that good, even though to this day, it's
It
like,
was so bad.
even to this day, though, it's still one of the most fun decks to play in terms of like satisfaction as a control player. I think no one can really argue with that because we haven't really seen a deck that has that kind of play style to date, like where you're actually able to put a huge emphasis on like drawing cards and getting +1s in the same way that Blue Purple Croc does, right? So just so you guys know, anybody who starts with Blue Purple Croc is automatically destined to become one of the best of all time. You heard it here first.
100%.
But enough about that. I know you were playing several decks, going into this event, and I want to know what kind of led you to switching off of the GOAT's pick and going with this red purple law deck.
Yeah, man. The main thing is that I think I just really chose to play RP Law because at the end of the day, I think it's pretty underrated, and you don't have to wait until EBO1 for the deck to be, I don't want like at least decent, right? It's definitely not the best deck, and it's not the strongest deck by any means right now. But I just don't like playing meta. I've never played meta. Actually, one of my tops in Yu-Gi-Oh was with meta, but other than that, I never really like playing meta decks, and I absolutely hate playing mirror matches. So automatically that excludes like the GOAT decks like Gecko, Saka, Kata, Yamato, Reiju, whatever else is out there, right? But I was looking at like the different builds that you had with Katakuri. I played like Green Kid for a little bit, trying to see what worked, but at the end of the day, nothing really clicked with me. So I was like, let's just kind of choose a deck that's already established, but figure out a way to play it better than everyone else, so I can still take down these meta decks. And then so I just felt like, Law is pretty rogue and it feels like a pretty fair pick. And then basically a week or two before the tournament, I just had a really big deck crisis. I was like, I need to commit to something. What do I do? What do I do? And I know you're telling me like, hey, don't switch decks at this point. Just play what you're comfortable. But I was like testing the deck against my other buddies, and I was having a lot of success. Then I reached out to my friend Joey from Heart Pirates TCG, and then Tyler Green from the Will to Win team. And they're both like, hey, RP Law is a pretty good pick, and people don't know how to fight it yet. Like, give it a shot. And then, so I really stuck with it. I was just like, screw it. Let's just roll with it. And I never really looked back from there.
Hell yeah. Huge shout out to Tyler Green and the Heart Pirates TCG. Go check them out. I think that it's kind of funny you say this being like a rogue deck, because I feel like at the time that you said you were going to switch to this deck for that tournament, it was like kind of like a rogue deck. But now I feel like everybody kind of has this deck on the radar. And I would say this is
Yeah,
probably like, I mean, I think you could argue it's one of the top four most popular decks after the black decks, potentially, right?
100%. Yeah, EVO1 and OPO7 really makes this deck significantly better. Unfortunately, as a non-meta player, that means that my last 2 weeks of learning this deck, I don't want to say it's wasted, but I'm most likely not going to be playing this deck anymore going into the next set, which is kind of dumb of me, but whatever. I'm going to stick to it. I don't really want to play meta.
Hey man, what I like to say is, we're retiring the deck. One of the most satisfying things for me in any like competitive card game is finding a deck that no one else is playing, figuring out what is the best way to play it, and then winning enough with it to where I feel like I've completely solved the puzzle, right? It's kind of like the Millennium Puzzle. It's like, okay, once I solve the puzzle, then I'm done with that deck and it's time to move on the next deck and solve the next puzzle. And that's where we're giving out this information to you guys today, because it's time to move on to new puzzles. Doesn't mean that this deck isn't going to be good, but we're here to do new feats in the game, create higher challenges and do things that no one has ever done before, right?
100%. Yeah, I think if the deck is already solved, especially since we get our meta all from Japan and Asia gets their sets before us. I think one of the big things that I like doing is figuring out a matchup that someone says is impossible, or trying to get a deck that people say it's just complete trash and getting it to work at least somewhat decently. I don't have to win, but if I can, go 8-2, I'll take it. So let's try to do that again, definitely on the next regionals.
For sure. And I mean, the aspect of topping with a rogue deck in this game is really understated, because a lot of people just don't see that as that big of an accomplishment. But to me, like having played almost every other like competitive TCG, I understand that like, in my success in the history of like all the tops I have, they've mostly all came for that same angle where it's like, okay, if I'm going to play a meta deck, it's because I feel like I can substantially change this deck in the current build that people are playing in a way to where it gives me a major advantage over other people also playing that deck, or I'm just bringing a deck that no one else expects, and then I'm getting that surprise advantage in that way. But I never want to bring a deck that everyone else is using a very similar list card for card, or is very knowledgeable about that card for card list, because it's the more information that you give your opponent before actually playing your cards, the less of an advantage that you are leaving yourself in that tournament, right? And I think it's really understated in this game how difficult that is with, us getting that information from Japan, from these other Asian countries on a delayed rate, with how fast information translates over the internet, with the fact that the simulator allows us to use those cards, almost at the exact same rate as they come out in Japan, as they come out in these Asian countries. And so it's really difficult to find something that other people are not doing, or other people have not already came out with a guide. And, that's why I think it's even more satisfying in this game when you do top with something that other people were not expecting, or other people are not playing card for card, because it is that much more difficult to achieve. And me personally, I am very excited that we are supposed to be getting the game caught up to a worldwide release within the next year, if I understand the information correctly. Don't quote me on that, but do also quote me on that and start a comment war telling me that I'm wrong, tell me that I'm right, because all engagement is positive engagement, even if it's coming from a Russian bot that's used to create issues within our community. It's all engagement I'm willing to take here.
Right. No, but I completely agree. I can't wait for like the deck building aspect of it to be something a little bit more unique. Whereas, the West, we would have to come up with our own meta and then kind of go from there and see basically a race to see who can break and crack the meta first without someone giving us the answer. But for real, like one of the most satisfying things in the tournament for me was sitting down across from my opponent, and they're like, "What does your leader do again?" I like barely played against RP Law, and then they had to read my card, and I was like, "Okay, I probably got this."
Really? Okay, out of how many of the matches did the other person you felt like, or they just told you that they weren't that familiar with your strategy?
So two people straight up asked me like what my leader did, or maybe not quite like asked me what my leader did, but they asked if I can read the card, and they asked me to clarify like, at what power level can I bottom deck a character and little things like that. So I'd say at least like two or three of the people I played against had never really had too much experience going into RP Law, and then the others were familiar with it, but it's still not something they play tested with against commonly.
Interesting. Okay, and
Yeah.
before we get into all of your matchups, I did just want to ask you how you felt about like the event overall, like how well it was ran. Because I know I texted you and it was like 5 o'clock, and like I'm over here like
Oh
drinking
man.
beers, watching UFC, and you're like we're in round six.
Yeah, and, it went late. I think we finished at like 10 or 11. Then you have to wait to get your prizes. Like, I basically didn't get back home till like close to midnight, or at least even get back to my Airbnb until close to midnight. So it was a long day. We started like an hour late. So it started supposed to start at 10, and I think we played our first game like 11 something. And then we got an hour lunch, which was nice, but getting back from lunch, everyone was a little bit late, understandably. And so we started, the second half of the day pretty late too. Then some issues here and there, but overall, nothing like from what I've heard about happened with Nats, but it wasn't great. But I mean, I had a lot of fun regardless. I met a lot of amazing people. All of my opponents were great. Really fun games, really great people to just connect with, add on Discord, get some phone numbers, and I just met a lot of people that like really I think made the experience a lot better than it could have been. Because if I was just there from like 10 a.m. till like 10 p.m. and everyone was like unpleasant, I would have just left. To be honest, I kept playing because I genuinely did had a lot of fun.
Damn, I mean, that sounds a lot better than what it seemed like. I mean, for me, if the tournament was going on that long, unless I was undefeated, I probably would have also just left because, that is a big part of the experience. And, like, from other card games like Yu-Gi-Oh, that usually is never the case. So, I mean, it is really nice
Yeah,
that this has been one of the friendliest communities that I have played at on a competitive level. I think this is one of the games where it feels like there's some amount of etiquette in the game, at least at this point. Part of that has to do with the rules being so clear to where if you're calling a judge, I like to say it's because either the guy just started playing the game, he is mentally disabled, or he's just a fucking dick. Like, there's really no like reasons you should be calling the judge.
yeah, basically. But really, the event, yeah, well, honestly, the community was great at this event. I had a lot of fun. I couldn't even leave if I wanted to. I was with my buddies, and they were like killing it. My boy Alex was driving, and he ended up going like X2 or X3 with like Reiju too, killing it, winning like 5 games in a row. So he wasn't gonna let us leave.
Hell yeah, bro. I mean, I'm glad you had a good time. And I do just want to say that 8-2 is a really good record. A lot of people want to go off like, what placing you get in the tournament. But at the end of the day, 8-2 is 8-2. And I think a lot of people really understate that because, you got like 50th something place. But to me, that's not really what defines like how well you did. It's more about the score just because of like the tiebreakers in this game being really random. Like I'm sure there was like an 8-2 guy that got ninth place, and that doesn't really demonstrate that he was overall just like a better player on you on that day. He had a way better performance, but he gets like $2,000 more in like prizing than you do.
Right.
So sometimes it can like seem that way, and it can be easy to like undervalue yourself and your performance when at the end of the day, like that is a really good record, especially for a person who this is essentially your first ever regional, since you only played one round in the previous regional and you don't play in person. To be able to, even get to that point, to have a good record like that and not feel anxiety like in those clutch rounds where it's like do or die is honestly insane, because even to this day, I've probably played in like over 200 minimum regional or higher events in any card game, probably more. And I still get nervous, at least at some point in the tournament, especially if the other person is also like really, really sweaty. So for you to go there
Yeah.
and do that, I just think that is amazing, especially when you hadn't played this deck for that long. And I feel like the deck itself is, it has some depth to it. I'm not saying that it's like insane in terms of like all these micro decisions, but it's definitely, I would say, on the upper end of the spectrum of decks that are like more difficult to pilot, especially like in a shorter time frame, right?
I agree. Yeah, no, I'm proud of this. I was surprised too because I was like, what happened, whatever happens, happens, right? I'm just gonna go in, try my best, and try to have fun. So getting this, what it felt like a good accomplishment. I'm pretty happy with this. So thanks, bro. I appreciate that.
For sure, brother. And the wins are going to keep rolling in. Make sure to see us
Oh yeah,
at the next Texas Regional when we both top and split the first and second place prizing.
Mesquite. Hell yeah, let's go.
On that note, I just did also want to say that, like, I feel like if you're a good player and you're putting a lot of time in the game, to me, X3 is like the threshold of like, if you are putting in a lot of time and being serious about the game, I think that you should go minimum no worse than 3 losses, no matter how many rounds are in the tournament. If you are actually at that level and you feel like you are, just because like the difference between X2 and X1 is not that big, right? Like the guy who gets top 8, it doesn't mean that he's way better than a person who has 3 losses. Like when you get into those final rounds and it's like this is going to decide who gets top 8 and who doesn't, it's like a 40% chance like, okay, you get an additional win or you do not. Because at that point, everyone is high level in those final rounds if they have, 2 losses or less or whatever. And it's really just going to come down to who chose the deck that beats the other person's deck and maybe who won the die roll, right? Just because I feel like at this point in the game, there's not as much depth as will be eventually added, such as like other card games like Yu-Gi-Oh! And Magic, which are just on a whole other level of depth. Like in this game, we still have decks that contain some cards that are vanillas, and that just kind of shows you that it's not like a big difference in skill differentiation for the person who got 1 less loss in this one tournament. Obviously, if you're topping every event, then you're insane at the game, but you can't really take that away from, just one event where you were close to topping. In my opinion, that is the same as like, doing your best as long as you feel like you made all the correct plays. Like you can only control so much.
Exactly. Yep, for sure, for sure.
But let's go ahead and have you take us through what your matchups were throughout the tournament if you happen to remember them.
Yeah, so wrote it down right here. Let's see. So, the matchups I went against 3 Gecko Morias. Those were tough. Let me tell you, those were hard. 3 Yamatos, with 2 of them being the Fortress build. One of them was the aggro build. 1 green Uta, interesting to see. 2 Katakuris, which was I was hoping to see more of those, and then 1 Whitebeard, surprisingly. So unfortunately, we didn't see any Reijus. I was really wanting to see Reijus, especially since Reiju ended up converting really well into the top placings in the tournament. I think like 2 or 3 Reijus ended up getting top 8 or top 16, something like that. But unfortunately, we didn't see any Reijus in Swiss. But definitely the hardest matchups were the 3 Gecko Morias. The Yamatos were a challenge too. And then my losses out of those 8 was to the Whitebeard player. He was amazing. And then a Katakuri.
Wow. Honestly, I'm really surprised to hear you say that the Reiju's converted. That definitely gives me some hope because
Yeah,
Reiju was my most anticipated deck to play in this format because I felt like it had a lot of depth in terms of like your ability to actually control the outcome of the match, because I feel like there's a lot of skill that goes into understanding when you can get behind on Dawn and still have time to finish the game with your judge and stuff like that. Like the conservation of resources in that deck, I feel like is really difficult to judge. Especially it's kind of different in each matchup to understand like the speed of what pace each person you're going against is at. And as I played the deck more, I really enjoyed it, but I also just felt like it was really bad versus the black decks. And that's why I'm really surprised that you're saying they were able to convert so well. I don't know if you agree with that, but I just feel like the Gecko Moria deck in specific just removes your game pieces for essentially free, and then you're just behind on Dawn, and you also have no game pieces, and then you just lose the game before you can play Vinsmoke Judge. Or they bottom deck your game pieces, and you don't get to summon anything back with Vinsmoke Judge.
right. Yeah, my friend Alex, he mains Reiju, and he basically was telling me how like the Sakazuki matchup is very difficult because people would think that you can aggro them, do like your rush ETG and like go really well into Sakazuki. But I think a good Sakazuki that knows how to play around that and stabilizes that and remove your pieces forces you to basically see judge or you don't, right? And so I definitely think Reiju has some difficult matchups. And for sure, it auto loses to Law, or maybe not auto lose, but has a 10% win rate, maybe at most, right, against RP Law. And so I personally, I wouldn't pick Reiju, but a lot of people really like Reiju out there. And I think there was actually a lot more representation than I was expecting. So I ended up converting pretty well. You just have to be a little bit lucky probably with the dice roll and then what you're paired against in the matchup. But I think it has some heat. I think it's definitely like can still be considered like, a top 5 pick in the format right now.
For sure. I definitely think that it has like more agency to the player, like I was saying. But in my experience, it just really felt like a lot of it came down to if you got to access, to Vinsmoke Ichiji, it feels like the deck is. There's games where you have Vinsmoke Ichiji, which are just broken, and then there's games where you don't. Because when you look at all the cards you can cheat out, well, that's the only one where you get to cheat it out for a +3 Dawn advantage, right? Whereas these other ones, you're still also having to return a Dawn to summon it out, but then you only get like a +2 Dawn advantage, and it doesn't feel the same, right? Like, especially since that guy, he's the only one that has immediate agency to be able to, attack the turn he's summoned. And I just didn't like that aspect of the deck. I feel like it has a lower level of consistency than these other top decks, but there is definitely some merit to playing this deck at, one of these regionals where this is why it's always difficult for me to recommend people to put cards in their deck to go against specific matchups, is because it feels like at these regionals, people are still at the point where they don't care that they know the black decks are the best deck. They're going to choose to play whatever deck they feel like they enjoy the most and the deck they have the most fun.
100%. Yeah, I'm like that.
Like you went against a Whitebeard person. It's like everybody knows like Whitebeard, he's bunk as fuck. And that guy beat you, And it's like going into this tournament, in all of the matchups we tested, did you ever even think about asking me to test against Whitebeard?
Bro, no. When I'm like, hey man, can I practice against you? Can we do Yamato? Can we do Gecko Moria? Can we do Sakazuki? Never have in my mind has Whitebeard crossed. I mean, I guess I thought about it once because it was a theory moment, right? When I was like, you know what? Whitebeard's a 6K leader. I can't swing 5K into him. All of my characters are 5K that I cheat out. So it's going to feel like Hatakuri trying to swing into Whitebeard. It's probably really bad. And I don't have Dawn to Dawn up my guys. I'm probably swinging very low into Whitebeard. How am I going to beat this guy? That sounds really tough. And then I thought about it. I was like, well, I'm probably never going to see one. I'm not going to worry about it. And then guess what happens? I don't see any Reijus. I get paired against the one random Whitebeard player that's there. I mean, props to him though. He's good. But I was just like, what the hell am I doing right now? It was rough, man.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I'm not taking anything away from that guy, but that is my point. Like if you are good at the game and you're serious about the game, I think you made the correct choice. It's like if you're a person who's trying to be good at the game and you're not able to go to locals like you have to be very conservative about your time management and spend your time in places you think are going to be impactful. I don't think it was ever the correct decision to build your deck in a way where I want to have a leg up against Whitebeard, because statistically, you're not going to go against one of those guys. But we're still in that effect, like I'm trying to convey, that people just want to play whatever they enjoy, and you can only cover so many matchups. I remember when I was in the Tulsa regional with my Zoro deck, and the first round I went against a film kid person, and that wasn't a popular deck. It wasn't a very strong deck at the time. The guy still ended up beating me, and it was his first time playing in an event. He actually borrowed another person's deck and had never played the deck before, and he started off the tournament like 8-0 or something like that. So it just kind of goes to show that at the end of the day, you can only control so much variance in this game, because even when people say, this is the tier list, this is tier 1, this is tier 2, this is the king tier, it's bunk as fuck, well, you can still go against king, and he could high roll into the 10 cost Kaido, and you're out of the tournament, right? Like, that's just not something that you can cover. You can only cover so many angles, and it would not be wise for you to try to cover more angles than are actually, like, realistic realistic because there is no side deck, right? So there's not a lot you can do there, and I think that definitely adds some merit to maybe why the Reijus were able to get in the top cut. Maybe there was a lot of representation, and maybe they went against Whitebeards all day. You don't know. Like, that is a possibility that you just dodged all black. I know I played in a regional in the all Whitebeard meta where I played against like 4 green decks and no one was playing green at that time. I played against 1 Whitebeard and my deck was built to destroy Whitebeard. Then I have a friend over here who copied my list, went against 7 Whitebeards and destroyed all of them. And it's just like, you can't really control that, you know? You just got to go in with, in my opinion, what is the best build to beat every deck. You know, I don't want to have these cards in my deck that are going to give me a slight advantage versus this one matchup, but take away from my overall consistency to accomplish my game plan, because I don't really feel like outside of the black decks right now, you can really guarantee that you're going to go against at least 1 to 2 of these other decks, right?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. 100%. I think that's why, like, if once we start talking about the deck list, there's gonna be a couple of changes. If I were to play this in OPO6 again, definitely some changes I'd make. Just because I think I did tech for a couple of matchups that I thought were going to be a little bit more difficult, but ended up those tech cards ended up not really mattering all too much.
For sure. So before we get into this deck list, first of all, did you choose to go first or second? And as well, what are the good matchups and what are the bad matchups, like in general? You don't need to talk about these bunk ass Whitebeard decks, but out of like the top 4 decks, like what do you want to go against and what do you not want to go against? Just to give people who don't have a lot of background information a reason why you chose to play this deck, because you were expecting certain decks, right?
Right. Yeah. So actually, backtrack a little bit, but during one of my playtest nights, I was playing against my friend Jimmy in my group in my team, and he's probably one of the best Gecko Moria players I know.
Shout out Jimmy.
He was destroying me, man. We played from like midnight to like 7 a.m. I couldn't win a single game. It was brutal. I tried going first, going second, tried everything, right? And I was like, you know what, Gecko Moria is gonna be. There's so many Gecko Morias in this tournament.
Wait, you guys played from 12 to 7 a.m.? Hopefully Jimmy doesn't
Yeah,
have a wait, hopefully Jimmy doesn't have a girlfriend because his stamina is high as fuck.
nah, man, he's single as fuck. Sorry, Jimmy, but dude, like I was getting so wrecked by him, and I didn't. I thought I was just gonna drop the deck. I was like, Gecko Morias can be the most represented deck. I can't win. I don't know what to do. And then that night, I just kind of theory crafted a little bit, and I went back and I changed the way I played. And afterwards, he couldn't. He basically couldn't beat me at all. Maybe once out of like 10 games. It was absolutely insane. But I still think Gecko Moria is a tough deck, but it's definitely not unbeatable. A lot of people were telling me before the tournament, like, hey, don't play RP Law because Gecko Moria is around. Like, he's going to kill everything you play out, and he's super tanky. You can't aggro him down. He's really defensive. He kills stuff. It is like your worst matchup. Don't like play RP Law. But I think I figured it out. And we'll talk about that a little bit more once we get into the deck list. But for sure, Gecko Moria is a hard matchup. Yeah.
In your opinion, would you say Gecko Moira is the deck to beat right now if you are preparing for a regional, if you had to choose one deck?
Yeah, if you have to choose one deck, definitely Gecko Moria. I know Katakuri's been doing really well, but at the end of the day, Gecko Moria is new. I think a lot of people just wanted to play something different, something a little bit more fun. And it's just something fun about black, just killing stuff and popping stuff, you know? So I definitely feel like one, I came across more Gecko Morias than Katakuris in my own run. And two, looking around people that were playing, it was full of geckos, man, especially as we started getting closer towards the top tables. All Gecko Moria. So yeah, that's the deck to beat. That's a tough matchup, but I think from people saying it's either unwinnable or like a 70-30, I think I figured out a way to make it maybe 50-50 or maybe even favored towards RP Law, depending on how you play it. Aggro Yamato is still really tough. Not like really tough, but like just the fact that if you don't see certain cards, they can burst you down since you're a 4 life leader. That's a matchup I played with you when you're on Yamato, and I felt pretty comfortable with it for a while, but I can see it being pretty scary. And Whitebeard, of course, I don't know what to do against a 6K leader, swinging, my bunk ass 5 into their 6K leader and pray, I guess. But anyways, the good matchups are definitely Katakuri. One of my losses was to a Katakuri. He just played it really well and getting, I think it was like Onami trigger from life, and he ended up having the counter, and so he was able to kill me. But overall, I think in a board state when they don't high roll you, or you see what you want to see, Katakuri isn't free, but it's definitely pretty favored for RP Law. And that kind of applies still going to the next couple sets too, which contributes to why Katakuri I don't think it's being played as much in Japan right now. Fortress Yamato is another pretty good one because you can just kind of kill that kid pretty easily. You drop it down to like 4 or 5, you just swing over it, and if they give you their entire hand, then you just bottom deck it anyways. And then Reiju. Reiju is actually just free. I don't think you can lose to Reiju, to be honest. The only way you lose to Reiju, I think, is if you shambles out Sachi and Penguin, you're not counting your Dawn, and then they get one turn to come back and they just screw you over there. But as long as you're tracking your Dawn, I don't think you can lose to Reiju. That's why I was really hoping to run into Reiju. But what's another popular deck here? Oh, Sakazuki. Sakazuki, I think, is 50-50. It's kind of like Gecko in the sense where they kill stuff. They do kill stuff better, more efficiently than Gecko, but they're also a 4 life leader, and they tend to. I feel like I don't know. I just feel like they're a little bit less defensive. They brick quite a little bit here and there too. They run less 2Ks, so a lot of times I'm swinging a 5, and I'm like, well, you definitely shouldn't take this hit, and then they would be forced to take it just because they can't counter out, and that tells me, okay, I'm just gonna swing some 7s and kill you there. We didn't run into any Sakas of the tournament though, which was surprising because I did tech some Fire Fist for Saka, but I feel like all the Saka players right now are kind of playing Gecko Moria just because same thing, right? It's new. It feels like Saka, and it's not going to get banned, so their time will be a little bit more rewarded.
I told him to take out the Fire
Oh,
Fist, guys. He would have won the tournament if he took him out.
no, honestly, okay. The Fire Fist came in pretty clutch because there was a game where I was playing against the Gecko and he had a full board, and I had like 1 life, and he had like 2 characters, and if he just swung at me next turn, I would die because I didn't have a blocker. So I ended up using a Gordon to take his Absalom to 2K, and then I use a Fire Fist on that Absalom to kill it, and then I bottom deck his other guy. So I was actually able to get rid of his whole board, which I think is really strong because one of the weaknesses to the RP law is that you can only really remove like 1 guy a turn. You only bottom deck 1 guy and cheat out 1 guy. So Fire Fist opens up some options for you to be able to kill 2 guys. Not efficiently, but sometimes it comes up. So that actually helped me that match.
I'm glad that you note that because that is like a big thing that I don't think a lot of people think about at first glance is that this deck does have very efficient removal. In my opinion, the biggest advantage to this deck, which is really defined our meta, and I don't see a lot of people talk about this, is how important the bottom decking mechanic has become in the game because we're at a point where cards are so high quality that you need to be getting upfront value. And what I mean by that is if you play your Vinsmoke Reiju and draw 2 cards, it feels better when it dies in the following turn because you got to draw those cards up front versus other cards that have a on KO ability. Well, the bottom deck mechanic that seems to be rampant in just about every meta deck allows you to just bypass that effect, that aspect of the game that a lot of these cards have, and then it makes it to where they get no value from that exchange. And it makes it feel like sometimes even though it's a 1-for-1 trade, it's almost like a -1 because you got no value and his bottom deck effect might have costed him little to no Dawn, right? So in terms of like the biggest advantage of this deck, I think it's just the fact that you have always access to the bottom deck mechanic, which is not present in every deck in the game. But when you do have access to that, it allows you to bypass just certain key mechanics in the game. And as well, that's a double-edged sword because the biggest weakness is, number one, if you don't have a combo piece to get you back in the game from that Dawn reduction, then it feels overcosted and it feels like the ability can be inaccessible at times. And as well, like you stated, you can only do that reasonably on 1 character per turn, and sometimes it can feel like you have redundant hands because you might draw too many modifiers that can only work to remove 1 card per turn because you only have 1 bottom deck mechanism, but you have a bunch of modifiers, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I think one of the weaknesses of the deck for sure is that because you're only relying on taking out 1 character at a time, if you're forced to see like a modifier every turn. And then the problem is if you see more than 1 every turn, it clogs up your hand and you can just die. And you don't really have easy ways to get rid of it. You just pray it out. You play it out and pray. But if you don't see it and you don't get to bottom deck a threat, and then next turn they develop another threat, you start losing a lot of tempo and you start falling behind. And that's something that I've seen happen over and over during my play tests. Is sometimes I start a hand with 2 raise max of Gordon and like some other rando card that's not a ramp, maybe like a rush Zoro. I'm like, well, I can't bottom deck it. I mean, I can't. I can like power modify them a bunch, and I can't ramp, so I can't keep going, or I have a ton of ramp and then no modifier. So definitely this deck is a little bit inconsistent for what it's trying to do, and that's probably one of the reasons why people wouldn't want to take it to the tournament. But I think if you build the deck properly, most of the time, yes, every deck's prone to breaking, but most of the time you'll see what you need to see. And as long as you can remove the first two or like first one or two big threats and develop a very scary board and win the tempo game early on, even if you can't remove stuff every turn, you can really snowball the game from there. So I honestly think the weakness of the deck isn't, at least to me, it's not bad enough to where I would justify not playing this deck right now.
Yes, and speaking for both of us here, I think it's important to note that when building the deck, you need to have a balance of these cards that when you look at the list we're about to talk about, most of our cards fall into 2 to 3 different roles, right? You have your modifiers, you have your Dawn ramp cards, which allow you to use your leader ability over and over again without being set back too far. And then you have your defensive cards, right? And you want to set up the deck to where you are going to open up a mixture of all of those. Because like we just talked about, if you open up too many of one, then you get these redundant hands where you just can't do anything, right? And that's very important to make sure that you have the correct ratio of each of those, because there are no searchers. There is some card draw in the form of Queen and Reiju, but there are no hard searchers to guarantee you grabbing one of those key specific roles, right?
Exactly.
I really like the fact that you use the word tempo here. That's the key word, because I know early in our testing, one of the things that you were doing that kind of just didn't allow you to reach the maximum ceiling of this deck is you were trying to explain to me that you thought it was like more of a controlling deck because it allows you to remove game pieces, when in reality, it's more so a tempo deck, and in my opinion, is very far away from being a control deck, because
Right. Exactly.
while you can get positive exchanges of values, it's on a time limit. You have to choose when to make these key pushes, because if you just keep recklessly using that ability over and over again, you either get into a situation where now you don't have the modifiers to remove a more important threat, or you're just set back too far in terms of the amount of available Dawn you have access to on the field to where you can't go for game from that point onward, right?
Yeah, like I was treating at first when I wasn't as proficient with the deck, I was treating it like Sakazuki, where every time someone plays out something, if I see it as a threat, I try to bottom deck it. And I'm like, well, the problem here is that like I run out of resources really fast. And if I'm predicting what my opponent's gonna play, a lot of times their next turn threat is going to be a lot like harder to deal with, right? So if I know like sure, maybe the first or the second turn they play out an Absalom or Perona, I only have one modifier, I'm probably going to hold on to it so that in the next turn, if they make a mistake and they drop a Sabo or they drop a Borsalino, I'll take that out instead. And so it's like recognizing those plays instead of just trying to kill everything and bottom deck everything. I think is really the transition point for me. Like this is not Sakazuki. We don't have a bunch of just kill two things, kill one thing, kill two things, and even then they run out of resources too. But here, like the way Tyler described it as like every modifier in this deck, every Gordon, every race max is a bullet, right? You have a bullet and you can make a shot. And if you're out of bullets, you're just screwed. So you have to make sure you're shooting at the right target. And so that really stuck with me. And from there on, I think my play really changed a bunch. Instead of killing stuff, I would hold like 2 or 3 Gordons just because I know later on they're going to develop like something really big that maybe I need to address, or just recognizing that, hey, this 5K attacker isn't really a threat. I'll play out 3 of them. There's so much value in cheating out a guy for free, even if I can't bottom deck anything. And I just had to accept it and be okay with that. And from then on, I started winning my games a lot more.
For sure. As both of us are in an open carry state, I can really appreciate the analogy.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome.
I did want to ask you, would you say that that's the biggest differentiator between like a good player and a great player with this deck, is knowing when to go for those tempo pushes? And as well as kind of a 2-part question, if you could give one piece of advice on that to people who are unfamiliar with the deck, what would you say to them in terms of like how to know when you need to go for that big push or when it's not worth it in simple terms?
Right, right. Backtrack a little bit because I forgot to answer this on my previous when I was kind of discussing about the deck. But this deck, you want to go second. Forgot to mention, I lost every single dice roll except like once, and I got to go second that time. I basically almost had to go first. A couple of times, someone gave me second because I don't think they were familiar with the matchup. But you want to go to second onto everything except Yamato. I think you take first from Yamato. Other than that, go second every single time. Even against Gecko Moria, you go second. But and onto what you're saying, I think really what separates a good player from a great player, and even then, honestly, I wouldn't even consider myself a great player yet. We're still working on that. But the main thing is like understanding. I don't think it's just like when to remove a character, when not to, when to push, but also from the very beginning, like how do you establish a board state that they have to address, right? Because a lot of the times, what I see is someone would on their first turn, if they're going first, they're at one Dawn, they pass. On their second turn, three Dawn, they play out a Zoro, and then they just turn it sideways. And then from at that moment, I was like, if you do that, honestly, I think you're ready to lose because now you're being denied a card from life. So you're going to be short on resources, and they're probably going to kill your Zoro, most likely. And then now you're going to your five Dawn turn with no board, and you lost a huge amount of tempo. So at that point, I think understanding that like hey like I need to develop a board and actually know when to hold back so that I can pressure with the wide board all at once is is probably the most crucial thing to learn is holding back with this deck because you're cheating out bodies. You're playing out guys that can rush, or you're playing out a bunch of 5k characters that you really don't have the Dawn to be able to play, and you're just playing them all out. And then the turn after that you're turning them all sideways, and if you're turning a card sideways at every chance you get, you're not going to have a board. And that's why I think some of the best RP Law players I know and I've seen have all played like Zoro at one point. Because I think the concept's really similar. Like you don't put two Dawn or one Dawn on Dadan and you swing if Dadan's the only character on your board. You develop more, you create an army, and then you attack with it. You don't send in one unit at a time to just die and get chipped away. And so a lot of laws, I feel like they run out of resources, they're denied of their life, and they just lose their board. And then they say the deck is bad, right? But that's the number one thing to go to becoming a pretty good law player. And then from then, it's all about predicting what your opponent's going to do. Because, like we talked about, right, you only have a certain amount of bullets. You can only kill a certain amount of things or a certain number of things per game based on what you see in your hand and what you draw. So if you can understand the board state and know, hey, next turn they're going into a Sabo, or next turn they're going to something bigger. Like I need to hold this card and then be able to kill them from there for a tempo swing. Then a lot of times you just bait it. Like you leave a body up and then you just kind of act like, oh man, like I can't bottom deck it, I can't kill it, dang it. And then they feel safe, they drop a Sabo, and then you look at their full alt art manga Sabo, and you're like, all right, I just win the game. Like it's basically that. There's a lot of mind games to Law because they're also trying to figure out what's in your hand. They're trying to figure out how many cards can you kill. Can they safely drop their kid right now? Can they safely drop a blocker? Do they want to trigger a Sanji from life? What if they trigger a Sanji to save them, and then I just bottom deck it because I have a Gordon in hand? Or do they want to hold that Sanji for a 1k counter when I go for lethal this turn, right? There's a lot of back and forth, and I think that's why that you always have to have a backup plan. You always have to have some kind of power modifier in your hand so that when a situation comes up, you're able to pivot and then reassess the board state and say, do I want to get rid of this card now? But if you just blow it all up and you're just killing everything on sight and something comes up that you don't expect, like you can just lose straight from that. It's resource management 101, basically.
Exactly. First of all, that was a really good explanation. There's definitely a lot of value to be gained from there. And I might even have to watch that back myself to fully comprehend everything you said. But I completely agree with you. And I really like that comparison about the Zoro deck because I also have said from the beginning that's one of the main reasons why I really tried to push the Zoro deck content, why I really enjoyed piloting the Zoro deck myself is I just felt like for the longest time, that version of Zoro that we had been messing around with really taught you how to fully comprehend the fundamentals of the game, and it helps you very easily translate those skills to other decks. And I see a lot of similarities just as you do.
Exactly. Your list with the 16 searchers, that list is broken. If y'all haven't tried that list, play it. I don't know about in this format, but play it. It is so much better than those other lists of Zoros out there.
Exactly, and it really taught you what you're talking about here. Where if you run out of resources, if you turn your card sideways before it's the time for you to go for game, you just automatically lose because good people will just deny you from getting your life cards. And that's
Yeah.
that's very important in this deck. I remember quite often in our testing, you could get into situations where, like we've addressed many times before, you either are missing one of the three key roles or you see too many of one, and now this one life card you're getting on your opponent's turn is the difference between you having the bullet in the chamber ready to kill their card and you dropping your gun on the floor in front of the bad guy.
Yeah, for sure. I think the problem with RP Law that was addressed from this set is the fact that now we have access to Reiju, and so it's like digging for more bullets, right? That's in a way like you don't run out of those bullets. I just really like the analogy, so I'm going to keep saying using the bullet analogy. But if you run out of bullets, you're screwed. We all know that. Now, if you have the Reiju and you have Queen and you have cards to dig up for that, that's what's going to help you sustain and last. But that doesn't mean that you want to be hasty with your bullets, right? Think about what you want to fire, think about what you want to kill. Is there something more important coming up?
100%. Well, I think we've kind of gone like pretty deep in the rabbit hole on the theory of this deck, and I'm sure a lot of people are waiting to get actually into the deck. So go ahead and talk to us about the modifier package is what I'm going to call it. So you got 4 Otama, 3 Gordon, 4 Raisemax, and 3 Toy Law. Why did you play this ratio of these cards?
Yeah, let's talk about the Toy Law first. So that's the one that it has been a subject of controversy because I've actually only liked playing 2, and to be honest, I added in a third because there's a lot of other players out there that says 4 is the way, and if you don't play 4, you're kind of trolling. But honestly, that card doesn't really come up much for me. I get that it's decent in the Gecko Moria matchup, like that's the one you want to start off with, but personally, like I just played a completely different strategy against Gecko Moria. We can talk about that a little bit later, but power modifier wise, like 3 Gordons and 4 Raise Max is like perfect to me because I also run 2 Fire Fists. Now, if I don't run the Fire Fist, I would definitely up the Gordon by 1 and play 4 and 4 because those cards are like they're basically what you have to see every game, right? It doesn't matter if you see multiple or only a few, you have to at least see some. And then Otama just being really the best, like 2K for this deck. The fact they can also modify something that comes up really clutch too. But really, the only thing that I overall I think is pretty standard. People play anywhere between 6 to 8 total between of the one cost, and the law is the one where I think I might have played out once, and it just doesn't really come up. Gecko Moria, I'm looking for my purple cards. If I'm playing against the Gecko Moria and I see the law, I might keep depending on the rest of my hand. If I have Sachi, Penguin, Kid, and Reiju, but if not, I'll just dump it. And I'm really looking for like Ein, Sachi, maybe Kid, Reiju, things like that, right? Because really, what like it kind of comes back to like the whole bullets thing, right? Like if I can ramp, the more I can ramp, the more of these one costs I can play later on. So I don't care if I can't kill their turn 1 Perona. They can make me discard. They can play Absalom, Hobback. Turn 2 Perona at 3 Dawn. It doesn't matter because at 4 Dawn to me, yes, I can kill it with the law, or I can play an Ein. And when I play the Ein, I go to 5 Dawn, and then I play out Sachi. I don't kill anything. Then then I'm back at 4 Dawn, and then the next turn I'm at 6. And at 6 Dawn, that means I can play a Kid, right? I can play a Kid and a power modifier. So on their turn at 5 Dawn, if they play out a Sabo for 5, then I just play 1 Dawn Gordon, 5 Dawn Kid, and then I kill their Sabo that they just play out. And if they turn their Perona sideways, it gives me something to swing into. So I go from having and then with that Kid that turn, I can play out something too with my shambles, right? So, and then get another Dawn back. So their turn, they're going from basically like a Perona and maybe a Sabo to just a Perona. And if they turn it sideways, I can swing into it. Whereas my board, and I wouldn't have tapped any of them, my board is Ein, Sachi Penguin, a Kid, and then another guy that I shamble out into, maybe like a Reiju, right? But if I go into that law and I don't get a first turn ramp with Ein, what ends up happening is that the turn after that, I'm at 5 Dawn. I don't get to play the Kid if I want to kill whatever they play. I would have to play a Gordon or Raise Max and then play a 4 cost. Which in this deck, the 4 cost, if you don't shamble them out, they're not that strong, right? Okay, maybe you get a ramp from like Beppo, but like really what you want to play on your turn is Queen or Kid because those are the ones you can't cheat out. So by looking for Ein and ignoring that toy law, you can go for your big plays mid game, and that's going to tempo swing you to the end of the game. I'd rather that than kill a Perona and have a law on the board and then slow down the next turn. So personally, because of that, I think the best thing about the law is just that when you shamble him out, he can reduce the cost of a character that's already rested, and then you can swing into him. So essentially, that's another way for us to kill 2 characters a turn, right? Because we get to bottom deck something, play out the law, weaken something else, and then swing into it. And that's basically what this deck wants to do. You can't just rely on getting rid of one guy at a time. You have to figure out ways to clear their board and control the board and hold the board tempo. So because of that, that's really the only thing that I use the law for. I hardly ever play it on my 4-Dawn turn anymore.
Sure. I think that 3 is a good ratio to play. In my opinion, that's the most correct ratio, specifically because, as you noted, it's good in a specific matchup that is probably, like we said, the deck to beat. So with that kind of card, you want to have 3 copies so that in those matchups, you know that you have a high chance to successfully mulligan for it in that specific matchup, but at the same time, it is a card with a counter, so if it's not that matchup, you can just discard it. So I think 3 is correct there. Is it standard for everyone to play 4 Ein? I thought some people didn't do that.
Yeah, because with the Ein, there's no counter in it, so most lists I see, like there's some lists I know that runs no Ein, which I think is just wrong, and then there's some list that plays 3. I think most lists actually plays 3. And when I was testing the standard, it was 3 Ein and 4 Law. But that's kind of what I was telling you about. Honestly, in every matchup, I would much rather just start off seeing an Ein, and that's why I switched the ratio. I think I'm the only one running 3 Laws and 4 Ein, but that's what worked for me, and I feel like that's a lot better. I have to test a little bit more to really make a firm decision on that. I could go back and forth between either, but personally, I just think starting out with an Ein is just too good. 1 extra Dawn is better than just killing something outright for a turn, in my opinion, because that carries over turn to turn.
I see what you're saying, and the reason I bring that up is just because I feel like, to me, the big reason why people play the law is because if you already have a modifier and the -2 just isn't really doing a lot for you, sometimes if you don't have something like that's really important to cheat out, it is a card that you can just play on curve and you feel fine with the size of the body. But considering you're playing for Ein, you already have ample copies of cards that you are willing to play out on 4-Dawn if you have nothing else to do. And so I think that if you're gonna play 4 Ein, it makes more sense, right? I just wanted to bring that up.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was going for. But yeah, everything else is pretty standard there. We run 7 other power reductors. We run 2 Fire Fists for that. And yeah, that's basically it for the first row. 4 Zoros, pretty standard surprise factor to kill them. Don't ever, like I mentioned, don't ever just play the Zoro and then attack with it right away. Like if you're going to attack with it, make sure you can protect it in a way that is not going to waste a lot of resources. Because what are you going to do if you attack with a Zoro, take 1 card from their hand, and then congrats, like, you know, you got a 1k counter from their hand and you lost a Zoro and you wasted your whole 3-Dawn turn. Like, don't do that.
And I was going to say, personally, the only thing that I would change with that is I think I would just rather have a 4th Gordon instead of one of these Fire Fists, specifically just because it costs 1 less. And a common theme with this deck is that most of your turns where you do a big play, the deciding turns of the game, you end up using all of your Dawn in that turn. And so for me personally, I just feel like that's more important to me. But I definitely see like the merits of having the Fire Fist, specifically because I think it adds like a surprise factor that you can remove more cards than you normally should be. And I feel like if that was a very common theme to be playing Fire Fist, that the actual value of the card would definitely be lower.
Right. I know. Yeah, because I know when you were telling me that you didn't like Fire Fist, but Fire Fist to me comes up in moments when I can just like against Sakazuki or maybe even Moria lately. I didn't run into one that plays Rebecca and Hina, but lately they are, right? And if they have like a Borsellino and a Rebecca, that Fire Fist will reduce one guy and then it just instantly kills the Rebecca, which I think comes up more often than you'd think in this meta right now with Sakas and Morias running around and Rebecca being popular again.
Sure. So moving on to the Rush Zoro, I know you already kind of touched on this, but I wanted to talk a little more about this card because as we've stated, there are the 3 common roles, or I guess there's like 4 common roles. You have your modifiers, your defensive cards, your ramp, and then you have your draw power. And then you also have this Zoro, which is just kind of like in its own role, being that like it provides you immediate agency on a lowest cost body as possible. And I think that it's really important to have 4 copies of this card. I don't know if you would agree, just because it is one of the few ways that you can efficiently afford to remove more than 1 card per turn.
Right, exactly. I think having 4 Zoro is a must. There's so many situations that come up where I just need to clear the board, otherwise they get lethal on me, and they would have just the right amount of characters. And making sure that you save up 2 Dawn, cheat out a Zoro, then be able to attack into a 5k character with 7, basically guarantees that you remove another. And if you can't, or if you can't remove a character, Zoro also comes up in situations where you can just outright kill them. It lets you do things in this deck that shouldn't be possible because at minimum, if you cheat out a Zoro, you get a 5k swing at life. And if you save 2 Dawn, you get a 7. And it's pretty easy to do so. And then the even nastier play is you can play out like a Zoro with 3 Dawn, swing at them for 5, swing with your leader for 5, use 3, swing with Zoro for 5, then use your 3 Dawn, cheat out another Zoro, swing for 5. So now you go from having just your leader to suddenly 3 attackers. And of course, that involves you seeing multiple Zoros, but like it's a deck that's decently consistent. Like you can see multiple of these, and you can close out games really quickly without them ever expecting, especially paired with your power reducers. Right, you pop a Sanji from life, and then you just go for lethal, or you clear out a blocker, and then you play out 2 rush Zoros. And a lot of times by that point in the game, if you're being aggressive appropriately, they're not gonna have that many cards in hand to counter out. Like you should be able to close games pretty easily, I think, even with low Dawn.
Exactly. I think one of the reasons you're able to get away with 4 copies of this is because in this deck, since we established it's a tempo deck and has similar tendencies to the Zoro leader deck, if you have a chance at winning the game, it's because you are never on the back end of the stick. You should always be the aggressor for the most part if you end up winning that game. And so for that reason, you're able to get away with playing less 2K counters and less cards that have a counter in general. So the deficiency of having no counter in conjunction with you having, Gordon and Raise Max, other cards that have no counter, really is not that much of a downside than it would be in other decks, right?
Right, exactly. I play, I think, 10 2K counters in this deck. Yeah, I only play 2 Kamazo, and I think that's the perfect amount. Like, more and you're a little too defensive, especially since in this list I choose to play Radical Beam, and I'll go Y into the Rad Beam later. But I think 10 2Ks is perfect. You never want to see just a 2K that's not, your Sachi. Of course, your Sachi and Penguin's the best card in the deck. Like, the boys, they fill multiple roles. But if it's not a Sachi, you really don't want your hand to be full of 2Ks. You need your aggro pieces. You need your pieces to keep developing board and getting the tempo and do what your deck wants to do. And so there's a lot of times where, like, if I run more than 2 Kamazo and I see a Kamazo and I'd rather it be like a Beppo or a Zoro or a Shiraya, like that's cost me games before too when I practice.
Yeah, for sure. Next, we've got the 4 Vinsmoke Reiju. There's not a lot to talk to about here. Obviously, we've already stated this is like the best card in the deck, but I did want to ask one question about this. When do you know, or how often do you play this card without cheating it out versus like cheating it out, right? Because I'm sure there's sometimes when you want to just hard play it, and I was just wondering if you could talk on that for a second.
The time when I want to hard play it the most comes up when I actually don't have a power modifier and I'm digging to try to find raise max. If there's something I need to kill and I can't kill it yet, and which means I can't cheat out the Reiju yet, really, then I would just, let's say, for example, I'm on 5 Dawn, right? I would hard play the Reiju, draw 2 cards if, I meet the conditions. And then if those 2 cards, I can draw 1 cost from it, which because we run 7 of them, there's a good chance that, after doing this a couple times, you would hit one. Then I have 1 Dawn left. I would play it. Then I would reduce the cost of something, or maybe reduce the power of something. Still think I'm Sakazuki. Reduce the power of something, and then from there bottom deck it and cheat out something else that's not a Reiju. Sometimes I would hard play Reiju, draw, and because I play out a Raise Max, I can cheat out a Reiju and get to draw 2 again, meaning that I draw 4 cards that turn and bottom deck something. Like that's happened before too. That's pretty crazy when you get to do something like that. But I actually play. Yeah, I hard play it more times than not. Sometimes it's just hard play because I'm looking for 1 cost. Sometimes because I'm looking for a Zoro to finish the game, and I know I need to cheat out a Zoro. Right? If I don't have a Zoro in hand and I need it to win the game, I need a rush character. Play Reiju, pray I draw the Zoro, then cheat it out and go for lethal. So Those are mainly the two. Like it's to basically increase your options of being aggressive.
Exactly. More options lead to more opportunities to win the game. And obviously, if
Right.
you get to play two Reiju, you probably automatically stole the game.
Yeah, at that point. And yeah.
One note to add there is this came up quite a bit in our testing is that sometimes you would be in a situation where it's coming down to the last two turns and you had to make a big decision with Reiju where you could try to put up another blocker and try to hold off into the next turn. And this is one of the areas where we kind of had to work on more because this was one of the places where I felt you were weakest is because there's a lot of defensive cards in the deck, you would try to like hold off until the next turn when in reality we thought about it more, and because it's a combo oriented deck where most of your lines require you to see more than one card in hand to play, sometimes on those final turns you do have to just risk it and play the Reiju and take the chances of finding that low costed combo piece you need to actually end the game, because it's very deceiving how much defense and survivability you actually have with how premium the removal is rampant at this point in the game, because you could put down your Shiraya and maybe you have like a kid or a queen and you think that that could save you, but because the person's playing Sakazuki or Gecko, they're able to just, reduce both those guys, rob Lucci, and then still swing for game. But if you did go for the Reiju and you hit your modifier to remove their blocker, or you hit your Rush Zoro, then suddenly you win the game. And that's one of the biggest mistakes I see from, people who aren't at that highest level yet, is they're not willing to take as many risks. So I just wanted to point that out on Reiju because that's definitely a very pivotal point in the deck, and it definitely affects a lot of wins. But enough talking about her. You already spoke a little bit on the Hitokiri Kamazo.
Kamazo, whatever. Yeah.
But I just want to know, how often do you actually play this card? Because in my opinion, I feel like you almost just never want to play this card because you have a bunch of other 4-drops that actually have a quite a bit more relevant effect. And in some ways, I personally would rather just go down to 8 2Ks because I feel like this guy is more one-dimensional as optionality, being that he's the one that you're most likely to just keep in hand as a 2K counter, since there's a bunch of other cards that are actually in that role.
Right, exactly. So he's definitely the worst 2K counter out of the sets I run here, but he comes up in the sense where at least like with his stat line, you can cheat him out. And so if you really need a body and you don't see any of your other guys and your hands just raise max, fire fist, rad beam, maybe like an Otama or something, then he is a solid option to cheat out, because at the end of the day, he's still 5K. He's still a natural attacker into the leader. He can still pressure, and his ability comes up weirdly. Like it comes up where I can kill like I think like a Sindri or something, or a brand new something that could like pressure me if they dawn up against Sakazuki, if they Hound Blaze, Tashigi, something like that. So it is a way to remove something that can just be an annoyance. It's not important, and it really doesn't come up that much. But if it does come up, great, because it is still just a free kill. Other than that, he's a 2K that's still a 5K body. So in a sense, in a way, he's not absolutely terrible either. But if I go down to 8 2Ks, sometimes I'm in predicaments where I want to count out early and I don't see him. And then it is a little bit of a problem against certain decks like Yamato, right, where I need a little bit more 2Ks. And so I think 2 is fine. I have tested 4 a lot and I have tested none, and I didn't like either. So I think 2 is a good fit right now.
Gotcha. So to kind of sum that up, this guy, you're way more likely to actually cheat him out than you are actually to hard play him, right? That's kind of like the big like reason why he's in the deck, is that like obviously he's a 2K, but he's reasonable to cheat out. But I feel like if you're hard playing him, you just have better options.
Yeah, if you really don't, I mean, I haven't really, because the ratios in the deck's pretty good. So there's not really a time when I would need to hard play him out because I don't see anything else. Usually I have another 4 cost I play out. And if I have to play him out and it's not because I cheated him out, then I probably lost the game. Then they probably know I did. Yeah.
Yeah, your hand's probably really weak. So moving on to the ramp package, obviously for Shachi and Penguin, that's just the best card in the deck other than Vinsmoke Reiju. and as well the Beppo. Ein is pretty much the only card that like has wiggle room here. The other two cards, that's your standard. No one's cutting that. We don't need to talk about that. But Ein, you also kind of already discussed that. How often did you feel like you drew too many of this card?
When it comes out of life, it hurts a little bit. But I'd rather the chance of it coming out of life than not seeing it at all early game. I think in terms of for my strategy that I use, I really want to see it in my starting hand, or at least the hand after, right? Or at least my draws the turn or two after. There's if there's games where I don't win, and if there's games where I win and I don't see Iron, it's because I probably have multiple Sachi and Penguin. But realistically, I'm relying on 0 to 1 Sachi. So in that case, Iron kind of plays as like a little weaker Sachi, but at least you get an immediate ramp. So sometimes you can play it and you don't even need to use your leader ability, and that's fine. Whereas Sachi is a little conditional to where if you want the ramp, you have to use your leader ability. And sometimes you can't cheat anything out, and sometimes you don't really want to bottom deck anything. You just want to hold your Dawn, save for a better play next turn. In that case, that's when Ein comes in. And if you see an Ein into a Sachi Penguin the same turn, and you hit 6 Dawn next turn, and you have an Ein and Sachi up, and next turn you have either Queen, Kid, something like that with a modifier, I feel like those games you win no matter the matchup. So I think Ein is really underrated, and that's why I'm playing her at 4. Not having countered though, yeah, it coming out of my last life or two really does hurt. But at that point, like, I mean, you just gotta have to. It's risk versus reward, right? You just kind of have to deal with it. It's not gonna come out of life all too much by running 1 or 2 extra copies.
100%. I mean, I think the card's basically just in the deck in terms of the math. Like we've talked about, you need to see a balanced amount of each card that's in the main 3 roles, being the modifier, the ramp, the card draw. Basically, with this, it just can allow you to buy a turn if you haven't seen Shang-Chi and Penguin yet, which sometimes can be the difference between you winning the game and losing the game, although it's not insane or anything. But the last thing we've got to talk about here is the defensive cards. So obviously 4 Kid, 2 Queen, 4 Shiraya, probably one of the best additions to this deck. Another reason why this deck is playable now. I don't think that if we didn't have that card that the deck would... I don't think you would have topped. It wouldn't be necessarily useless, but that deck definitely covers a lot of areas that were previously open in the deck. And as well, we've got the 2 Radical Beam. So starting off with the Radical Beam, I just don't really like events in this deck. I feel like for the most part, you want to be using all of your Dawn every turn. And the Fire Fist is a little bit better in that aspect because it's proactive and not reactive. And I feel like sometimes your best friend can be the other person thinking you have a Radical Beam when you don't actually have one in hand, right?
Yeah, I would say the Rad Beam is so clutch because sometimes right before you run out of gas, I would come into situations where I tell myself, man, if only I have another turn. Because most of the time, you're gonna kill them decently fast. With the way the deck works, you just are. You're going to swarm the board, you're going to attack into the life, attack into the characters, take a ton of cards out of the hand. And then the problem is against other decks, they're able to swing back at you, especially if you don't see your blockers. Sometimes you're just racing life. If they know they can't just clear your board fast enough, they're going to throw like Yamato, double attack at your face and stuff like that, and just try to cheese you or trigger out of life and try to attack you. And there's going to be a lot of times where you don't finish them off and they have 1 life left, maybe 2, maybe none. And then, but if they attack you back, you're kind of dead because this card just plays a bunch of stuff from hand. If you don't see your Reiju, you actually don't have a lot of counter. So what Rad Beam does is it buys you an extra turn, whether they think they can kill you or not. Regardless, it guarantees that you either save a body or you survive and you deny their lethal, and then you can clap back and actually just win. Because sometimes they have to commit. When they look at your board state and you have 4 guys on board and they have 1 life, and they're on their final turn, they have to just go for it. The main thing I realize is that they're just going to go for it. Like we talked about risk before, they're not going to be able to clear all your guys, right? They're just going to Dawn up, swing at your life, play some rush characters, and a Rad Beam that can literally, be a 4K counter and save you. So it's the difference between some games. And I understand there's a very narrow line of play, but on turns when you leave it up, I think saving up 1 Dawn isn't a bad thing, especially if you have kids and other cards that's a little bit more Dawn efficient. But the main thing is you're never going to leave up a Dawn all the time. You do want to use up all the Dawn. But if Rad Beam comes out of life, and you think you're gonna die that turn, save up a Dawn and hope you hit a Rad Beam from life. Hope you draw into it with Reiju, because most games with the amount of draws I get with Reiju, I do see the Rad Beam, and I've used it basically every time I've seen it. So I do like it. I get why you don't like events, but it's come up so much for me that at this point that I don't think I can cut it.
Sure. And I feel like 2 is probably the correct amount to play if you're going to play any at all, because in my opinion, the most relevant play window for that card is when you're doing your normal play and you already have a 5-cost kid on board, and then the 5-cost kid ends up giving you a Dawn as an active, so then you don't actually end up paying that cost, and it's kind of increasing that window of you being able to play the card. Whereas if you were playing more than 2 copies, you're likely to draw multiple, and in those circumstances, you can only afford to pay for 1, right?
Yep, exactly. So the kid really opens up the play for the Rad Beam, and sometimes even without the kid, just I do a lot where I like just pretend that like I messed up my Dawn count, and I was like, oh crap, there's a Dawn left. All right, well I'll pass, or I'll leave up a Dawn and I take a card and I pretend to put it down like, should I play a Gordon right now? And then I was like, nah, I won't, and I just put the card back in my hand. But in reality, I don't have a Gordon. I just left a Dawn up for Rad Beam. But sometimes you just got to psych them out a little bit. That's really a lot of what this deck is your opponent's trying to read you. They're trying to figure out, does he have a Gordon? Is he going for lethal? Does he have a Rad Beam up? There's so much mind games to this deck, play by play, that sometimes you can just psych them out and they think you're going to bottom deck something. You end up holding a Gordon, leaving up a Rad Beam, or vice versa.
But yeah, exactly. If there is a Bandai representative watching this video right now, basically he just admitted to scamazing his way through the tournament, just making people think that he is actually a noob, like telling people he's never played in a local tournament, doesn't have that much time to play. When secretly in his mind, he's just like, I'm actually just being coached by beatsbyash, best of all time. Ha!
Bro, I'm not lying, man. Like I don't really play all too much, but prior card game experience and work and stuff, sometimes you just gotta, I mean, that's half the game, right? That's card games. Half the game right there is trying to figure out what you have and what you don't have. So it's all fair, man. It's all good.
For sure, I'm just kidding. But other than that, did the ratios of the defensive cards work out well for you? I feel like that's kind of just standard, right? Like everyone who plays 4 Shiraya, 4 Kid, maybe more than 2 Queen, right? That might be the only thing that's different.
I've thought about cutting some Shiraya. It's kind of funny because like I ended up not really using that card all too much, because even against like Yamato, I would get to go first. The one dice roll I win, I get to go first. Yeah, you almost want to go second every time. I think Yamato's the only matchup you want to go first. As far as for my testing, that I think worked best. The main thing with Yamato, with going first against Yamato, is that you want to develop the initiative, because they are also an aggressive deck. Most deck in this format, you're more aggressive than them. So going second is okay. You don't mind passing the initiative to them so that you can start bottom decking stuff and then take the initiative back and start attacking. But against Yamato, a lot of times they don't even play anything. They're just attacking. And so them being able to attack first sometimes can hurt, especially since the turn after that, they're going to be able to Dawn up more and do that again. So depending on what you think they have, you will play out those turns a little bit differently in terms of when to take the attack and when to counter. But I just don't think letting them do the first attack is the right move, considering you're a 4-life leader as well.
So the Shiraya, you're saying, is a lot more important when you go first?
Yeah, the Shiraya is good, but actually, like in a matchup I played against Yamato, I play out the Shiraya, and then on their 4-Dawn turn, they attack me for 9. They put all the Dawn on their leader, and I could have blocked with the Shiraya and discard a card, but I didn't want to go -1 in card advantage in hand, and I'd rather just like take the attacks. So I ended up taking those 2 attacks anyways, and not even blocking with my Shiraya, because I just wanted more options. And so I feel like maybe that was the right play, maybe not. But my Yamato opponent was just like, what the heck is this guy doing? Like, why would you do that? And then I ended up being the only RP Law that was able to beat him in that tournament. And I feel like it's because I did that and just kind of like got a lot of advantage and went from there. And so I felt Shiraya came up a little bit more like late game, when like, you're really deciding on how to kill and stuff, and they only have 1 reject. They kill Shiraya or a Kid. So Shiraya is a cheap blocker to cheat out and to play later, but everyone's saying like Shiraya is really important turn 2. I mean, I just didn't really see it, because I kind of wanted to take the damage regardless, to be honest. Maybe it's the wrong play. Maybe I got lucky and it worked out for me, but yeah, I was never scared to go down to 2 life against Yamato. as long as I know I can stabilize. So I just took the damage even if Shiraya's up. But I don't know. I don't think it's as important as I once thought it was.
So basically what you're saying is, since you kind of found out that it's not as important to need to play a blocker on turn 2 and that you could have waited, you could just be waiting till turn 3 and playing one of your other blockers instead and just getting the same like benefit that you would have got by playing that card, right?
Exactly. Because if they attack with however much numbers they attack with, like a blocker's a blocker. Sure, Shiraya's and a blocker with one card, you can negate any attack from the Yamato, but at the same time, if they're gonna reject it anyways, they're gonna reject it, right? So I didn't really care too much to see it in the beginning because I know for a fact, at least during the tournament, like I wanted to take the first 2 life.
So is it standard to play for Shiraya? I thought that was standard, but
It's pretty standard, but I would have been okay running 2, to be honest. Now that I've played in the tournament, I would have been okay with 2. 2 to 4, I wouldn't cut it out completely because it comes up a lot. But like against Gecko, it's kind of useless. It'll instantly get popped. Against Sokka, it's free as heck for Sokka. Katakuri, I guess it's pretty useful in Katakuri and Yamato, but I think 2 would have been okay with me too, even though 4 is the standard. But I don't know. It's just kind of. I also play this a little bit weirdly. I feel so.
so the kid is standard as well, right? No one plays less than 4 kid.
No, you have to play 4. Probably third best card in the deck.
And queen, do people play more than 2 queen? Is that different? Or how did you like that card?
Yeah. So actually, a lot of people I know don't really even play queen, and they choose to play the law blockers. The ones that it's like 4 costs, 5K, and it makes you discard, makes the opponent discard. They choose to play that because it's something that can be cheated out. I personally have a strong dislike for that card. I think it's reasonable against Whitebeard, which who would have guessed that I would play against a Whitebeard, right? But I just don't like that card because if you're cheating that card out, you're already going -3 Dawn. And if you go -1 more Dawn with that card in order to make them discard, then you're essentially going -4. And that means next turn you're starting off 2 Dawn less than where you were this turn. And especially since you're not playing out a ramp if you're cheating out that law. So I personally think that law, it sounds tempting because of the discard, but it slows down your entire game plan overall a little too much. So with that, so I would rather just play the queen -1 and then get a little bit more resources with that, and queen being a harder blocker to get through. Because at the end of the day, the weakness of this deck isn't that your opponent has too many cards in hand. I don't care how many cards they have in hand. I'm going to run through them anyways. They're going to counter everything at some point, right? The weakness is that you run out of cards in hand. So if I don't see Reiju, queen's a good kind of fallback plan. Not as great as Reiju, but it works. Whereas you're putting yourself more behind for really not too many benefits by playing that law.
I completely agree. I mean, by not playing another form of card draw, you're putting a lot of weight on the outcome of your matches being determined by you drawing a Reiju, and I think that's just a bad deck building practice. So I feel like you need a minimum of 2 just for math.
Right. Yeah, and on 6 Dawn turns, sometimes you play a queen, right? And then you use your lead ability, you draw 2, you draw into a Reiju, and then you can cheat out that Reiju, draw 2 more. Like there's just so many combo lines to this deck when you have the card draw that queen opens up so many more lines of play for you.
For sure. I think specifically in this meta, I have a high weight on 5 drops in general just because of Black's removal requiring additional modifiers if your card costs more than 4. You know, with stuff like the Absalom or, you know, like Rob Lucci, it's very likely the guy has minimum 1 -2 modifier. But by putting out a 5 drop versus a 4 drop, you have a drastically higher chance for the guy not to remove your game piece next turn. And to me, I think that's very important.
Exactly. I mean, they basically see Ice Age or they're going to lose a bunch of resources. It feels great when I play a kid and you see the guy start sweating. They're like, okay, I'll play a Suru and I'll play another Suru. And you're like, okay, well, you kind of just win that too, you know?
Yeah, if they have to use, sure, if they have Ice Age, they have it. But at the end of the day, that's still better that we're forcing it out, right? Because then they don't have it for a later turn. And as well, like you're saying, if they have to go double Suru, yes, they did still get rid of our body, but they also just went -2, which that just means we're probably going to win anyway, because now it's a higher chance their attacks go through. So,
Exactly.
all in all, I just want to point out that in this meta, I think it's very important to not undervalue 5 drops in general. That's just a very important position in the curve at this point where Black is really popular.
For sure. Yeah. And even if they Ice Age you, they're going -1. If they do anything else besides Great Eruption, they're still negging cards. So in that case, like I don't mind at all because I know they're not gonna have an Ice Age for another card I play later and so forth. Because at the end of the day, their stuff are bullets too. The more great eruptions and Ice Age you see them going through, I track all that, track to see what they're returning to the bottom of the deck and keep track because at the end of the day, if they play 2 Ice Age, I can drop another kid safely later on, and I'm not worried about it at all. And I'm not even going to try to play around a possible third or a fourth one.
Exactly. So it looks like we've talked about just everything in the deck list. So I wanted to go ahead and ask you, now that the event's over, are there any changes that you would make going forward?
Yeah, so I think the Fire Fist, I mean, I still like it in some scenarios, but I do think that it is a pretty narrow line of play. So there's a good chance I take out one Fire Fist, maybe put another Gordon, and then take out the other Fire Fist and put in a Law. That way we still have like the same amount of power reducers, but at the same time having an extra counter with that Law, and then being able to run a full playset 4/4 of the Gordon Race Max is going to come up pretty good too.
I think I agree with that, to be honest. I mean, like I
Yeah.
said, I value having the lower costed cards more than anything, just because I feel like all of your combos require you to use all of your Dawn, right? And so I definitely agree with that. And like you were saying about like not wanting to have a non-searchable one of, I definitely agree with that as well. But before we end this, I did want to ask you to go ahead and elaborate on what you were originally saying about how you were losing to Gecko Moria a lot, and then you changed the way that you played the deck.
Yeah, so basically, I touched on that a little bit earlier, but everyone says the win con against Gecko Moria is seeing the Trafalgar Law, and starting off with that hand, you mulligan for that card. My strategy against Moria is basically ignore that Law. I think it's overrated. It's good, but what you really want to establish is a very strong mid game because you want to make sure that they can't safely get into their Gecko play and be able to have enough pressure. And a lot of times, if you play the Law, and at best, if you shambles into the Sachi Penguin, you're starting your next turn at like 4 Dawn or like 5 Dawn or something like that, right? And you're just not going to have enough Dawn to pressure them. And then their mid game to late game starts getting a lot stronger than you. So since your early game's already pretty strong, I don't care if I use the Law and kill a Perona, or I don't care if I use the Law and kill an Absalom, right? I can leave that on the board. It's already got its on play effect. What I'm looking to remove are things like Kuzan or things like Borsellino and Sabo, and I want to be able to remove them on curve. So by ignoring the Law and trying to find an Ein instead, I can go Ein, be at 5 Dawn, shambles into Sachi and Penguin, and then next turn be at 6 Dawn, where I can play a 5 cost character that they're going to have a lot harder time removing and still remove a key piece, such as a Sabo or a Kuzan or a Borsellino with the Gordon. So that's kind of my strategy there that I've started doing instead of just removing a Perona on site. Because now, once I'm in that position, if they want to clear my board, because nothing's going to be tapped really, if they want to clear my board, they have to have an Ice Age to take care of a kid or a queen. And then they also have to have like a Great Eruption, maybe even another one. And then at best, they can do is Great Eruption, Ice Age, Lucci, and that's going to take up their all 6 Dawn. And then next turn, I kill the one character they play, and then I shambles out another. So that's my way of keeping tempo. But in order to do that, I need to be able to have that extra Dawn from Ein. So by playing Ein instead of Law in that matchup, I started winning that matchup almost every time to the point where like they just don't really know what to do on 6 Dawn. Right, on 6 Dawn, and the best way is if they run Hina and they play Hina and Absalom. They can kill out something and cheat out 2 bodies. But most Gecko Morias can't cheat out 2 bodies on 6 Dawn, so it guarantees that I can still kill something if I'm at 6 Dawn myself.
Okay. I mean, that's very interesting. Would you say that a big way that people like misuse the deck, especially like in that matchup, and why it might be seen as like a bad matchup is because people misuse the leader ability too early, and it's just really important to hold off using your leader ability until you see one of those very impactful game pieces like the Borsellino or the Sabo?
I think so, especially in the beginning when their pressure's not that high. I don't care if they tap an Absalom to attack me for 5. I'll take the damage, then I'll kill it. Or their Perona, I'll kill it. Like, I don't really particularly care if they swing into me because at that point they have no pressure yet. But the biggest mistake I see is that people would play the Law and then they would reduce the cost of that Absalom, for example, then bottom deck it, and then they can't even cheat out a Sachi and Penguin. They cheat out like a Beppo or an Ein, and then they end up going back to what, like 4 Dawn next turn, and now they're at a point where they need another ramp card in order to even keep up with the pace, but they're still going to go negative Dawn if they do their shambles again. So the only way you can hit 5 Dawn is with Sachi and Ping one. So if you go Law into Sachi and Ping one, that's fair because at least you're at 5. I just think going Ein into Sachi and Ping one's even better because then you go into 6. But definitely, if you play Law and then you bottom deck a Perona just to play out a Beppo, and you have 2 bodies, but next turn you go into 4 Dawn, like, dude, they're gonna kill both of those guys. And then at 4 Dawn, you're gonna be able to play one character. And then if you shambles again, you're just out of luck and you're just gonna fall so behind. So don't shambles unless you have enough ramp, even if you can kill something with the Law. That's why ideally I don't even care to see Law. I'm just trying to get as many Eins and Sachis and kids in my hand as I can in that matchup. So my starting hand, I'm mulliganing for 1 red and the rest of my hand is purple. So I'm looking for one cost guy. And if the rest of my hand is like a Beppo, an Ein, a Sachi, or a Kid, or a Queen, some kind of combination of that, then I'll keep. Whereas everyone is telling you against Gecko Moria, you're hard mulliganing for that Law. That just never worked for me. And that's probably why that matchup feels unwinnable if you think that's your strongest play.
That's some very insightful information, and I think it definitely helps build your case on why you should be playing for Ein in the deck. Does your opinion change at all depending on what they have in the trash? Like, for example, if they have no Thriller Bark cards in the trash, would that make you more likely to want to remove that Perona or that Absalom instead of waiting for the Borsalino or the Sabo because you think maybe they won't be able to guarantee summoning a guy off their leader ability, or not at all?
I think if they're not already milling Thriller Bark Pirates into their trash at that point, they probably have something else in hand that they can play off of their leader ability to discard anyways. And if not, they're probably going to hard play a Navy. So regardless, if I feel like I can effectively remove their body, then I will. If not, I don't mind holding it at all and seeing what their next strong play is. Like, I'm just not really afraid of whatever the first guy they play out is. And especially like there's some games where like they mill Perona and I don't see any Absaloms in the trash. And on my 2 Dawn turn, I draw a card. I'm at 6 card. I'm like, all right, I tap 2 Dawn. I play out 2 Gordons, and now I'm at 4 cards in hand. They can't even Perona me. And at worst, if they do hard play an Absalom or play it with their leader ability or anything like that, they're killing one of my cost reduction. I still have another guy that I got to play out that I'm not going to use any Dawn for later. So, and that's assuming they have an Absalom. But if I see a Perona in trash, a lot of times I can just change and I just play 2 1-cost characters. And if they can't remove either of them, I know for a fact they're not removing my Kid next turn or anything next turn, right? So at that point, I feel like the game's already won.
Okay, good. I'm glad that you brought that up about playing the double 1 cost, because that was something that we kind of addressed early on, where you were kind of hesitant to play down 2 1 costs at the beginning because we originally thought that like if you do that, then the other guy maybe next turn he has like Rob Lucci or something that just removes both, and then you just have no modifiers. But I like that you bring that up because I think one big thing that has really shifted in the middle of this meta, and this can also be why Gecko Moira is doing better, arguably slightly better than Sakazuki, depending on how you look at it. People haven't really started to focus on changing the way that they play versus someone who could potentially drop down a Perona up until recently, in my opinion. Obviously, like, some people are going to be like, nah, man, I've been playing around going to 6 cards with a Perona since day one. It's like, bro, shut the fuck up. You have not been doing that. You didn't realize that you need to just aggressively play out your cards until after your opponent made you discard with Perona turn 2 like 10 games in a row.
Exactly. And since I have a lot of friends that main Gecko Moria, I just drilled that matchup and know how to kind of play around Perona and other cards in that deck. And I think it's good because if I didn't play test that much against him, I would have thought that matchup is unwinnable too. And so I started looking for other cards and playing towards different win cons. Like, my win con's not matching them card for card, is spiking my power level mid game and then pushing them really hard at the end to the point where, like, if they don't have the counter, they're not going to be able to play out their Gecko Moria, and they're sure as heck not going to be able to kill me as fast as I kill them. And so I just put them in situations where they're forced to turtle up, and even then it's not safe. And so it's just not efficient to use everything in the very beginning against them, despite what people have been doing in this matchup.
Exactly. Like, you can make an argument that, like, okay, I shouldn't play out both Gordons because then he could rob Lucci. But at the same time, it's also an equal chance that he just plays Perona and I end up discarding one of the Gordons anyway. A lot of people don't bring that into consideration when bringing up these arguments, right?
Right. And if I go second and I'm on my 2 Dawn and I play out double like Gordons on their 3 Dawn turn, like they can't even like play a Lucci, right? The best they can do is either play Perona or play an Absalom. And if they play an Absalom, I lose one of those 2 guys, and then that Absalom's dead. Right. And if they play a Perona, they just get nothing. So it's even better when they play a Sindri turn 1 and I look at their trash and there's no Absalom and it's just a Perona and they're like super happy about it because that's what usually you want, right? Your best turn 2 play is Perona. That's what the Moria wants to see. And I'm here. I'm like, well, you're not gonna get any value out of that, you know. Should have mulligan, bro.
That's a good point. Now, I did want to go back a little bit when you were talking about the mulligan. Was that specifically just for Gecko Moria, or do you have a different ideal mulligan that you'd like to see just across the board for people who aren't as acquainted with this deck?
Yeah, I think the only really change is like against the Sakazuki, you just kind of want to have a Zoro just because later on that Zoro is going to have a lot of pressure. Sure, you can try to draw into the Zoro later, but having one into the Zoro is pretty safe. I think against Yamato and Katakuri, having a Shiraya in hand's pretty good. I wouldn't hard mulligan for any of that, but the one thing I'll basically hard mulliganing for in every single matchup is some combination of Sachi and Penguin and Reiju. If I see Sachi and Penguin and Reiju, I keep. If I see Sachi and Penguin and a power reducer, I generally keep. Or if I see a Reiju in some form of ramp, I would keep. Because Reiju is going to allow me to get resources. So even if I can't bottom deck anything without a power reducer, I will keep as long as I can ramp. Sachi and Penguin with anything, I'll keep. Really, like you just want to make sure that you have at least some form of consistent ramp in your starting hand. And that's why like I play, like when I'm mulliganing for, I'm looking for mainly purple. Like mainly purple. Like, yeah, you're going to see 1 or 2 of your power reductions because you run a lot of them, right? So, I mean, you run a lot of them. So you'll draw them eventually, but your purple, if you don't see them by a certain point, you're kind of screwed. Your Gordons and Raise Max are always good no matter what part of the game you're in. But if you don't see you're in a clock to find your ramp. So always look for those. That's why I don't really get why people are hard mulliganing for Gordons and Laws. Those will come up, but you really want your purple cards. And another reason why I don't play Buena Fiesta or whatever, that film searcher, because at the end of the day, you don't care to search for laws, you don't care to search for your power reductions. You'll see them when you need them. But if you play the searcher, you're gonna like pass by all your good cards, which are your purple cards, your best cards in the deck. If you bottom deck a Sachi, you bottom deck a Reiju, you bottom deck a Kid, that just hurts. So for sure, like don't play that card. Mulligan for the cards that are actually good in your deck, which is majority purple.
That's a very good point. You know, in my mind, I was just kind of thinking like, okay, ideally, you would like to have one form of ramp, one power reducer, and then obviously if you could also have a Reiju, that would be ideal, right? But when you put it in the context of what you said, although you do want to have a mixture of those, and that would be ideal, if you have to make the choice between having one or the other, you would much rather have one of the pieces of ramp, because as the game proceeds, the value of your ramp depreciates while the modifier value is constant throughout. It doesn't matter when you draw a Gordon, it's always going to do the same thing. Whereas with Ein, it doesn't do almost anything when you're already at 8 to 10 Dawn.
Yep, exactly. Late game, even I would argue, even at 5 or 6 Dawn, you don't want to play out an Ein. It just becomes a dead card in your hand. Like you just don't need to, because what at that point, what you're looking to play out is Reiju, or you're trying to stabilize with a Shiraya, or you're trying to pressure with a Zoro. If you play an Ein out after Dawn, after turns 1 or 2, it just doesn't feel great. And then same thing with Sachi. At a certain point, you're never going to 2 or 3 Dawn again, even with your leader ability, because you're already at a stable Dawn point, right? So Sachi and Penguin becomes a 2K counter later on as well. But whenever you hard draw a Gordon from the top of your life, you know for a fact something is dying that turn. And that is really, really powerful. So I don't mind if I don't see the power reducers in my hand, but I'm just trying to fish for those purple cards. And if I see the combination, like you said, then it's ideal. If not, we'll get it later, baby. We'll play out the Reiju. We'll get those later.
Very well said. Before we go, do you have any final piloting tips for anyone out there?
I think the main thing is don't underestimate using power reducers just to swing into things. Like a 8 cost kid, for example. If you only have one Gordon, you can't bottom deck an 8 cost kid, but swing into it, eat up their whole hand, and same rules apply, right? If you swing 7 into a 5, they're not going to save it. You can use that on Moria, you can use that on kid, whatever needs to be gone. And another big thing is that just because you can remove something doesn't mean you should. For example, against Big Mom, I mean, they can play their 7 cost Lin, and I can play a Fire Fist and an Otama, and that's gonna drop that 7 cost Lin to like 2 or 3K. I can't math right now. I don't know, but it's gonna drop it in range of your leader ability. But that's gonna eat up 2 cards. And that 7 cost Big Mom already took a life, right? You already trashed a life when it's on play. So now all it's doing is taking a damage. All it's doing is dealing a damage every turn. Like you don't have to spend your leader ability and 2 extra cards to remove it when you can remove a 5 cost that's also just going to be doing a damage, right? So being very efficient with your cards. Don't just waste them, because I've also seen law players where they drop 2 Otamas and a Gordon and they remove 1 card and they're down 3 cards in hand. Like, it's managing your resources is really, really key. And then of course, don't turn your Zoro sideways right away unless you have a full board to back it up, or unless you have ways to protect it, because at the end of the day, losing bodies will lose you the game. Like, this deck floods with bodies, but it's hard to protect a bunch of guys. They're replaceable, but they're not like Zoro. They don't replace themselves that often unless you have Reiju. So be careful with your guys. Sometimes it's better just to hold back and then attack them 6 times all at once with 5, 5, 7, 7, 7, rather than going 5 at a time and then just getting chipped out. So be really careful with board management. You, in this meta, you shouldn't be losing board against any deck. I don't think there's any deck that can swarm the field faster than you can. So just play to your strengths and don't dump your hand protecting something you shouldn't. And don't put your cards in positions that you have to be protecting them so much in the first place.
100%. Yeah, I actually lied. I have one more question. Typically, when do you want to start blocking damage? Do you want to stop taking damage at 2, or do you stop taking damage at 3?
So the good thing in the black meta is that I don't mind going to like 1 or even 0 life if I know I can stabilize, and especially if I'm being able to control their board as I go, right? If I know they're playing a Gecko Moria and they're playing out 2 guys and they're all going to be able to attack me, then I can try to stay a little healthier. But if I'm already in a spot where I'm pressuring them a lot, I don't mind taking damage at all, because realistically, if they're good, they're going to try to attack into my board and try to control my board before I just straight up run them over. So I go to pretty low life. Against Yamato, the sweet spot is 1 life. You don't really need 2 life against Yamato. 1 and 2 is no different. Just make sure you play around Hody Jones, and sometimes 1 life is what you need, because as long as you can block either an 8K or a 10K swing that last turn, it's fine to be at 1 and be at 1 and have 2 2Ks in hand. That's really all you need, or even 1 rad beam, and then you just take 1 damage and block the other, and the next turn they're probably dying anyways, especially if they're taking a life from Hody Jones. So and those are already the most explosive decks in the format. Of course, things change depending on category of how much they trigger and how many big moms they see and stuff. But generally, I go down a low life. I mean, we have 10 2Ks. I have 2 rad beams, and I play like 10 blockers. Like, I'm not that afraid to play a low life. They can't really burst you down as easily as you'd think.
Are you willing to go lower if you have the Fire Fist in hand, or does that just not really matter? Because I know you get the additional effect of that.
Yeah, it really kind of just depends turn to turn, depending on who I'm against and what they're at, right? So the main thing is that, like, as long as like you know for sure you can't die the next turn and you can kill them within that turn, then I'll go lower and I go to 0. But if there's at any point risk that I'm dying, then I'll play around that. Like, I don't mind leaving up blockers and not attacking with them too. Most of the time I'm attacking with my kid and queen and even Shiraya. But if I'm playing around like reject and stuff, then I keep some of them up. But it comes down to the KO potential of the deck.
Okay, awesome. Do you think new players underuse the aspect of using the leader ability without playing a character?
I think something that I commonly see is that, well, not commonly see, no one really plays this deck, but something that comes up a lot of times when I'm watching games or when I'm talking to people about the deck is that at the end of the day, Law's ability is utility, right? You can adapt it to any situation. If you want to cheat out a body, you can cheat out a body. You don't need to bottom deck something. If something needs to die and you don't have something to play, and that thing needs to die, like, bottom deck it, right? Sure, you're kind of telegraphing your hand a bit if you don't play something out and they know you don't have something. Then it gives a lot of information if you don't cheat it out. But at the end of the day, if you need it, if something needs to go, man, it needs to go. Like, I'm okay with that. It's not ideal, but big part of this deck that I think why I was drawn to this deck is the adaptability of it. Like you can play your leader ability defensively and also offensively, ways to cheat out rush characters, ways to control the board a little bit, ways to win tempo. There's a lot of things you can do. It's very not one dimensional. It takes a lot of like fundamental knowledge of the game to pilot this deck well. But if you know that well and you can use your leader ability for whatever situation, I think this deck really will reward you.
Okay, for sure. Just wanted to point that out before we go because I do think quite a bit of people who are unfamiliar with the deck don't know that you can choose to do one or the other with that ability if you haven't experienced it before. And I definitely think it does come up sometimes where you don't have a guy to play, but you do want to kill something like you said. Before we go, do you have any shout outs or any last things you want to say?
Yeah, man. I mean, definitely thank you, bro, for having me. Thank you for being like, literally one of the greatest people in the game that I got to play with as a playtest partner and as a mentor. I think I learned so much in this game from you, man, and I have to attribute a lot of my success to you and a lot of my other mentors in this game. So definitely shout out to Joey from Heart Pirates TCG. He definitely was one of the inspirations for this deck, taught me a lot about this deck, and definitely Tyler and Will himself from the Will to Win Gaming. They've been with me from the start of this game too, just being able to have friends that are good at this game to be able to challenge me as well to get good, and knowing that like I'm putting my time playing against people that will push me to the next level. So thank you y'all for that for sure. And of course, huge shout out to my boys, the Jelly Bean Pirates. That's my team that we competed with. We are a playtest group based in Houston and Austin. So shout out to them. Bonnie, Jimmy, Alex, Joel, Richard, Shri, John, Kawol. Y'all are the GOAT. Keep it up, man. I appreciate y'all for pushing me to where I am today. So thank you, all of y'all, especially you, Ashby, man.
Appreciate you, brother. Guys, make sure to stay tuned. Me and David are planning on setting up some tournaments in the future. We've got a little bit of a twist on a new kind of format that we want to do to bring some new content. Potentially going to be doing some commentating with that, introducing potentially some like higher stakes money matches just to add like another level of flavor to the game, attract people that are going to want to get some more serious games in and who genuinely want to get better and are not playing to play, playing to get better at the game. So if you're interested in that, make sure to join the Discord. Link will be in the description, and we will keep you updated with that in the future. Me and David will be at the next Texas Regional, so make sure to dap us up or your fake friend. This has been really fun. Me and David are definitely going to have some videos going on in the future, so make sure to stay tuned for that because our synergy is insane. As always, thank you so much for getting this far in the video. Thank you, David, for coming on and also topping and representing Team Jelly Beans and Team beatsbyash. As always, if it's not the goo, it's got to go. Peace.
Ooh, is that indigo?